Today I'll be talking about, as I alluded to, just kind of getting started with Docker. This is useful for those that are kind of going from an 8.2 to Sitecore 10, but it's also there's going to be a few topics on image modifications that are going to be useful for those that are adding a new Sitecore solution for Sitecore 10. There's going to be a lot of customizations I'm going to show through or walk through of image customizations that you can make to Docker. So who am I? Already kind of hinted at who I am, but basically my name is Dylan Young. I'm most notable for my Sitecore channels on YouTube. I have about 2,100 subscribers as of to date. I also provided a link there to my Docker playlist. So I have about 4 videos right now. I'm hoping to actually create some new videos coming up. Some of the topics I'll be talking about today, I want to go a little bit deeper into. And so definitely subscribe if you haven't already and check that out. So let's just kind of get started. What is Docker? I'm not going to do any fancy diagrams or really talk, about the terminology of Docker and all that. I think that's, you can go and search what is Docker online and you can figure that out. So Docker is just a container technology that Sitecore is using. There's others out there, but it's kind of the more common and most popular one. Microsoft is also using it fairly as well. It's similar to a virtual machine, but a little bit smaller footprint from a disk drive perspective. Typically, virtual machines are several gigs, maybe even tens of gigs of size, whereas a Docker image is only going to be 1 or 2 gigs at most. Docker is very great at standardizing the development environments, makes it really easy to get set up from a developer standpoint, or if you work for an agency or something like that. It's very useful because then you can run basically multiple clients on the same machine without having to worry about all the dependencies of that. It's super easy to set up. This is probably the reason why there's a big shift to this in the community right now. So the alternative methods was CIF and Sitecore Install Assistant. This one's a lot. Once you get used to the ways of working with Docker, it's a lot easier, and you can get up and running a lot quicker. A topic that was just talked about in George Cheng's topic was just the fact that you can actually use Linux and Windows. You can even run experimental mode and run them together on the same machine. I've done that once before. And it doesn't require support elements locally. So I've seen this question a few times in the Docker Sitecore Slack channel, where people ask, what version of Solr do we need? What version of SQL do we need to install locally? You don't need to worry about any of that. That's all within the containers for each individual setup of Docker that you're running. You don't even need IIS. And if you're running and getting Docker running completely, you don't need any of that running on your local machine. So if you're getting started for the first time, there's actually a really good repository out there where there's a PowerShell script by Sitecore Gabe, where you can just run that script and it will basically install the prerequisites for you. If you're not going through that script, you're basically going to need a Windows Pro machine, since Home does not support some of those Windows features. You'll need those Windows features enabled containers and Hyper-V, and you'll need also Docker Desktop installed. One other thing to note about prerequisites is if your organization is thinking about using Docker for your organization from an organizational standpoint, you're going to need to think about the disk space or the specs on that developer's machine. So 8 gigs is really not going to cut it. You'll at least need 16 gigs, and 16 gigs will allow you to run certain topologies pretty well. But it's recommended that you run a 32 gig machine. I will say I run most of my stuff on 16 gig laptops. And most of the times I'm okay, but I will say I'm actually avoiding doing any live demonstration in this video or this session, just because I'm worried that I'll run into issues with performance because I'm on a 16 gig laptop. So there is some performance issues that you have to be aware of on a 16 gig laptop. So I just want to talk a little bit about why upgrade to Sitecore 10, just a short slide. Most of this video is all talking about Sitecore 10.1, but in Sitecore 10, Sitecore released a public container registry. This basically includes base images for all the topology services, so like CM, CD, things like that. Also for all the topologies as well, like XP0, XP1, XM1, etc. And it also contains some asset images, which we're going to talk a little bit about coming up shortly. And then with that as well, Sitecore keeps making improvements as each new version comes out. They make enhancements to it. So there's new tools in it and things like that. 9.3 was kind of the first real good version, and then 10.1 thereafter they made kind of improvements from. So if you're upgrading from an older version, you're thinking about Docker, I would say go to the latest version, obviously. But if you're really thinking about using Docker, that would make the most sense. So now we're going to talk about some Sitecore Docker basics. So if you're new to Sitecore and you're new to Docker, these are some common syntaxes you're going to see, common file structures. You'll see these in the GitHub repos that you can reference and go from there. So so the Sitecore Docker registry that I previously mentioned, it's for Sitecore images 10.0 and plus, so 10.01, 10.0. 10.0, 10.1 is what's in it. There's a complete list of all the repositories and tags for that inside GitHub. There's kind of two different types of images that you might have. There's asset images, and then there's topology role images. So asset images are something we're going to talk a little bit about when we talk about customizations. So there are modules and things that we can install. Those are in asset images. And then the topology roles, those would represent like a CM or CD or identity server, etc. So common files and folders, I just took an example of a solution I had set up. There is a Docker build folder. In that build folder, you'll typically find your build definitions for the different services that you would have. So CM would have its own Docker file, which we'll talk about here in a few moments. It would have some other different build configurations as well. There is a data folder. A data folder typically contains your log files. These are typically, everything that's within the data folder is usually volumes that you have mounted in your Docker Compose file. So like I said, log files, SQL, MDB files, and your Solar cores will typically exist within this data folder. It's a useful folder if you're going and you're wanting to see the contents of maybe your CM is not firing up. Well, if it's not firing up, it probably won't have logs. But if it's firing up and you want to check to see what else is in it, you can go from there. I guess someone's here. Then there is a source folder, which is a folder that just contains files related to your foundation feature project. And so that's what's in there. That's a typical folder that you would have. You have a .env file. The .env file is, where your environment variables are stored. These are typically name value pairs. We'll show that in a little bit. You have Docker compose file and a Docker compose override. Typically, your Docker compose file is kind of an out-of-the-box configuration file. And then your Docker compose override is where you'd have customizations to your Docker compose file. And I kind of got ahead there with my clicks or my speaking. Sorry, there's somebody knocking on the door. That was weird because it's 11 o'clock at night. So the Docker compose file, just showing that file real quick. Obviously, this file is much larger. This is going to contain multiple services that you're going to be running to make up your Docker instance. So there is, for this CM represents one of those images. And then, so there's multiple services there. Isolation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about isolation coming up. But out of the box, typically you have default isolation defined. The image here is just the image. In this case, because this is a Docker compose file, you're just mentioning you're just pulling from the Sitecore Docker registry for the image. And then I just comment here as well, this is a environment variable. So there's a lot of these defined throughout this document. And these are just pulling from your .env file. And then depends on, this is very useful for each service that you're going to define. It basically says that the CM depends on certain roles. So in certain cases, CM can't run without identity server being run or XConnect, or in this case, those services being started. And then lastly, there's one more. These are the environment variables that are passed into our image. This contains connection strings. We're going to talk a little bit more about how you pass in some of these environment variables. Some of these are config builder variables, but you can even pass in custom ones if you want to into your image to make customizations to it. And then lastly, there's a labels section. This is used mostly with traffic. So traffic is a reverse proxy, and this is just a way that you configure traffic to tell it what entry points to use and what the host should be. I'm not sure. And then this is a Docker compose file. Typically contains modifications to that Docker compose file. It's a good place to do your build configurations. It's typical best practice to have a build configuration per service. So as you can see here, and as I click, you have a build service or build configuration for the identity server. You're defining the context. The context takes you to that Docker build ID folder that I was kind of showing before. There's actually a Docker file that's within that path, but you don't need to specify the full path. It knows that it's looking for the Docker file here. And then you're passing in arguments. In this case, you're passing in a base image. Note the fact that you're passing in the Sitecore Docker registry image. And that's going into your Docker file to be built. And then because of that, it's then outputting the image. The image, it would be something that would be custom to your instance. So basically, long story short, you do a build. Sometimes you're going to make customizations to that build and output a different image with your specific name. For example, a lot of this was just ignium.xp0-cm would be the name I would put out. And then that would be the new image for your project. In a lot of cases, you don't need any customizations. You're just going to just pass in a base image. Like, for example, identity server, there's not much customizations. You're just going to pass in the Sitecore Docker image, and then you're just going to essentially spit it back out and give it a new image name. And then in some cases, and we're going to talk about this in a second, you're going to have a lot more customizations if you're adding custom modules and things like that. So, so lastly is just talking about the build files that I was describing before. So these are the Docker files that sit underneath. This is, again, within that build folder, the Docker folder, the build folder, and then each role is defined, CM, CD, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a Docker file within that. I'm not going to go too much into the solution part of this. There's typically a solution file that's, or a solution build that also happens that then is added to the CM role. But that typically is defined in your root, and that's what this is kind of describing. There's a Docker file that builds your solution, and then you add it to your roles. Okay, so so this is an example of a Docker file. I picked obviously the most complex one I could. There's a lot going on here. You can make a lot of customizations to your Docker files, or you can make very few. It depends on what your use case is going to be. I would say if you're shifting to Docker for the first time, you're probably going to have some customizations to it. You're going to want JSS, or you're going to want maybe some custom modules in there. So the top part is where you define what args you're going to pass in. In this case, we're passing in custom asset images, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So there's different asset images we're passing in. We're passing in actually ones for headless, which is JSS, Horizon, Content Hub, things like that. Here we just define that we're going to use PowerShell. And then just to kind of pick one out of the random ones, because there's a lot of configuration going on here. We're just telling it to essentially take from one of the images that we passed in. We passed in a JSS image or a headless image. We're basically just telling it to take the contents of that and then place it inside the new image that we're building. And so that's essentially what we're doing with each of these tasks, or layers is what they're typically defined as. These are layers or steps that are going through for the Docker file creation. So that's all the kind of nitty-gritty of the getting started into that. Now we're going to look at specific scenarios of things that you would be customizing with your images. So these will all be related to those Docker files that we were looking at and customization so we'd be making. So the first one is you have a Sitecore module that you want. So typically when you first start with the examples, or maybe you've used a starter kit, you will have, it will just be a Sitecore XP0 or an XP1 or whatever it would be, whatever you define. But in a lot of cases, you want to add Horizon or JSS or Content Hub to those images, whatever it may be. So that's where you start using these asset images that Sitecore provides. They have, as I previously noted, on GitHub, there's a link on one of the previous slides where you can get a full list of all of these. There's also a documentation on Sitecore where it lists the steps and where you need to install stuff. But really what I want to show here is that there's a standard format to those asset images, and it's always the same. So that kind of is detailed here on the right. So for any DACPack files that you would have, those would go in your C module DB file or DB directory within that asset image. If you had content that you wanted to overlay on a specific service, such as a CM or CD, whatever it may be, those would exist in that role. So for example, CM is a common one. C module CM content is where the CM specific overlay content would live. Less common, I don't see this as often, but if you had solar cores that you wanted to add in, you would have those in C module solar. And then any sort of tools that you might have, like such as initialize content. I forgot which image or asset image uses that, but that's something that you would add as a tool. So I actually just released a video today on how to do Sitecore Horizon. And so that's, if you're looking to know what the general steps are and interested in knowing how to do Sitecore Horizon, I would check out the video. But generally the steps are relatively the same. You would, there's inside your Docker Compose file, the override file, you need to make sure you specify the asset image as an arg for this Docker file that I have described here on the right. And then you would also specify it as an arg here, as well as a from here. So for example, I'm just passing in a horizon image. And then lastly, depending on what is needed, and this is just a very short example, I'm not actually doing the full demonstration of this, you would add in from horizon, and you're just overlaying on this, because this is a CM Docker file. You would just overlay that horizon module CM content into that what is the CINET WW root folder for this CM service. And so you're building a new image, and then now what this does is it doesn't, this part is actually not the service itself. This is the this adds the button and things like that inside your CM environment and some of the configuration that's needed. I'm not going to show the MS SQL customizations you have to make, or the changes to add the service. If you want to see those, you can watch the video, and it's got that sort of detail. So another common scenario that you're going to run into is, so it's great if you want JSS, you want Content Hub, things like that are Sitecore modules. What if you want something that isn't a Sitecore module? Let's say you have a redirect module that the community built, maybe Brightcove has a video or a module that you want to install. There's actually a pretty easy way to get those modules converted into a format, or basically convert them into asset images, so you can install them the same way that you would install a Sitecore module. So you would typically take the Sitecore package. You would use something called Sitecore Azure Toolkit. This was typically used for past instances in the past to create a scwdp file. From that file, it will, and that is really only needed if you need the DACPack files. So if you only need DACPack files if you have customizations to content items in your content tree for that specific module. And then you would essentially take the contents of that Azure Toolkit, the scwdp file, and convert it into a folder structure that you can then create a new Docker image from. And I went ahead and did an example of this. I found SUGCON, it supported a Sitecore 10.1. I was basically looking for an open source module that would support that. I found their package file. I took that package file, used the Sitecore Azure Toolkit, converted that over to the scwdp file. And what I used is then that basically output some contents of that. And I put those in this module CM content folder. And that basically is their app config, the DLLs they need for running the script. And then it also output the DACPack files that I need to make customizations to Sitecore. So I put them in this DB folder. And then lastly, I just add a Docker file, which I highlight over here on the right. It's super simple. It just has a nano server image referenced. And then we just take and copy the current relative folder that you're in, and it moves it into the C drive of that image. And so all you have to do then is do a Docker build, and then you have essentially a asset image that then you can run through and run the same steps that you would do for a Sitecore supported module. If you wanted to, if you're a community, let's say you built something for the community, a module. If you wanted to, you could do a Docker login to Docker Hub, and then upload your images up to Docker Hub so that anybody can use your images and not have to go through this process. So I would highly recommend that if you have an open source module out there. Another common customization that is seen in Sitecore and with Docker is overlay patching. So this would be, let's say you need to make some sort of patch to harden something, maybe for security reasons or something like that. You want to add those to your images. You would basically specify a folder underneath your CM build CM folder, or wherever the patch you want to put that into, and just put a folder called website. And then essentially you would just add the exact path of where you want this file to live. This would beat adding this into your solution if you don't want it to be tracked via source control. In that way, you just want it to be baked into your image. You can also use environment variables here as well. So something useful as a customization you might want to make. And I just called that out. And then just quickly talking about environment variables. I just showed basically a custom environment variable that you can pass in. Those would apply if you had a Sitecore configuration change that you want to do. In that example I just provided, it was a setting. If you want to make changes to connection strings, web config, there's actually a config builder that is provided as of 9.3, I believe it was. And that basically allows you to do Sitecore app settings, role, and then define. So you're basically able to, you don't have to specifically make patches to your web.config. You don't have to do XDT transforms. You can do it via these config builder methods to essentially patch those settings. And I just this also works for connection strings. So if you add a connection strings for some reason, you need to, I can't think of a good reason, but there may be maybe for Content Hub or something like that, then you can essentially just add this to your environment location. This snippet is in the Docker Compose file, by the way. So you would just be adding an additional line to then patch that specific connection string that you added. So another common type of customization you would make to your Docker files is your Docker build files is transformations. Let's say you need to you want to add a environment, a rule-based config change. In this example, I want to pass in an environment define. Typically, you don't want to hard code it like this, just showing from examples perspective. But you can add a folder inside your build CM, call it transforms, and then you can add a web.config.xdt, basically a transformations file. And then you can use the common syntax for XDD transforms. And then lastly, then in your Docker Compose, or not your Docker Compose file, your Docker file, your build Docker file, then you can essentially use line 17, which is basically saying copy the transforms folder to, in this case, it's moving it to C transforms role. And then line 20 is where you basically do the XDD transformations. You run that C transforms role folder onto your CINET pub www root, and it will you basically make those transformations there. Okay, the last one is one I've actually done a few times personally, and that's just overlaying files into your image. A popular use case would be Sitecore support files, such as, you find an issue with Sitecore and they provide you support files to fix that issue. Another issue, or an issue that I specifically have run into, is you have Razzle and you want to include its service into your image. You can do that just by creating a folder. It doesn't have to be called website. And let me click it. It doesn't have to be called website. You can call it whatever you want, as long as you handled it correctly in the Docker file. And essentially put all the files that you would just want to put overlay into the root of your instance. In this case, I'm doing the CM, so this will just put it in the C inet pub ww root, and this would just add in the Razzle service into that root folder, and then this is where I use that in. So. Lastly, just talk quickly. I think I'm running low on time. Converting existing solution. Just wanted to talk about serialization real quick. TDS supports Docker as of 60014. So as long as you upgrade it, there's a few configurations that you need to do, but it should work. It works well with Docker. I've had it used it a few times with it. And then the same with Unicorn. Unicorn really fully supports it. You just have to be cautious about where your serialized files live within your container. And so you might have to do some customizations with volume mounting to make sure that it has the right path and is accessible within your container. And then lastly, for those that are upgrading, the most common scenario I run into is Gulp. Gulp usually exists as the old way, or I will say the old way of doing things. You can either choose to remove Gulp and kind of use the solution build exclusively, but then you have to solve for maybe you have to compile SAS files or whatever it may be. So I don't always tend to go that direction. I like to go with the second option, which is just install Node as part of your solution step, and then just run the Gulps process as part of that. And I just show an example here on the right of installing Node in there. And then lastly, or I guess I'm not quite as done as I thought, but there's two types of isolation. Just to talk about these real quick. There's process and Hyper-V. The default, if you ever have default defined, is Hyper-V. Hyper-V is typically meaning that there's going to be a virtual machine wrapping each of your container. That has some benefits because it's better for supporting multiple different types of OS versions in that Hyper-V state. However, it can be a performance issue as well. So if you're running on 16 gig laptops, sometimes it's better to look into process isolation instead, because you don't have essentially those VMs wrapping it. I included a link below which kind of talks about what version you have and what if you're running in process or Hyper-V, what options you have. And then just talk quickly through the debugging. You have three basic options. Visual Studio 2019 is my preferred option. You have a containers tab, which basically allows you to view files, environment variables, etc. My favorite thing about it is you can attach code to a running process in your CM or CD, whatever it is, inside of an image, essentially, which is pretty nice if you're trying to debug something on your CM instance that you just wrote. There is Visual Studio Code, pretty much just as good, except for you have to install a Docker extension into Visual Studio Code. It includes a lot of the same capabilities, except for, as far as I'm aware, you can't attach the debugger to your code. So that's the only negative of that. And then lastly, Docker Desktop. I find this tool has improved drastically over at least a year I've been using it. And it's pretty useful for kind of getting a good grasp of the memory usage that your different instances are using. So some helpful links, just a short sampling of links that you guys can check out. There's some different examples, and I think that has a good breadth of different types of places you can get information on getting started with Docker. And lastly, here's some links. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Slack. I'm on Twitter. I'm pretty much everywhere. Definitely check out my channel on YouTube. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Dylan. We're light on questions, mate. Given a very comprehensive presentation, that's not surprising.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't seem to have any specific questions. But I have one for you. So, given we are generally getting cumulative hot fixes now for Sitecore, how would you intend to apply those in a Docker situation?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. I'm tempted. I mean, if they're just patches, the overlay method is what I would suggest. I know that Sitecore's own Docker, as long as you're referencing that Docker registry as one of your args, every time you do a new build of your image, it will pull in the latest of theirs. And so if they're doing, as far as I've been told, they're doing frequent updates to their own images. So as long as you're doing regular kind of interval images updates of your own, I would assume you'd be pulling in their customizations as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. And I don't know if there's probably a way to there's probably a link or something like that describes that a little bit more.
A question from Rodrigo.
Dev targeted Docker instance. I'm not sure what you mean by dev targeted. I mean, so if you're talking about Kubernetes, I know there's more sessions on that. I will say, typically, I've seen different methods of that used. You usually will do a Docker, your Docker compose files. You might have a custom one for your CI process that will build the images, in that process, push them up to a container registry that you host for deployment purposes, and then that's where your Kubernetes service would pull from. I mean, if you're referring to cloud hosted from just some sort of like Amazon I think Amazon Code Spaces or Web Spaces, I forgot which one it is. Basically, where you have a VM, then it should be relatively the same setup process as if it was a local machine. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, I'm on Slack, so I turned my notifications off, but I'll turn back on. So I'll happily answer your questions there.
Great, thanks very much, Dylan.
Thank you, Dylan.
No problem.
Now is the time for solidarity in the face of this threat to all of humanity. I implore leaders to stand together and heed this appeal.